Picture this. It's 1400 after Christ, and while European knights are clanking around in armor, worrying about the Black Death and wondering if the world might actually be round, something extraordinary is happening in North America. Groups of people are moving south through mountain passes and river valleys, carrying with them knowledge that will reshape an entire continent. These aren't your typical migration stories. We're talking about one of the most sophisticated military cultures the world has ever seen, and they're about to claim a homeland that will become their fortress for the next 6 centuries. Long before any European eyes gazed upon American deserts, Apache peoples were completing an epic journey from the forests of Canada. Think about that scale for a moment. We're talking about a migration that covered more ground than the distance from London to Istanbul, through terrain that would challenge modern hikers with GPS and REI gear. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing catastrophe. These were organized groups following ancient paths, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of storytellers and scouts. When they arrived in what we now call the American Southwest, they didn't just settle, they divided the landscape like military strategists. 6 major groups emerged: the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, Western Apache, and Kiowa Apache. Each claimed territories that stretched from the Texas plains all the way to Arizona's mountain ranges. But here's what makes this remarkable. They weren't fighting each other for this land. They were preparing to defend it together. Within canyon strongholds that seemed impenetrable to outsiders, and beside hidden springs that meant the difference between life and death, Apache bands developed something unprecedented, the most sophisticated guerrilla warfare system the continent had ever seen. We're not talking about random hit-and-run attacks here. This was systematic, scientific, the warfare that would make modern special forces commanders take notes. Consider what they were teaching their children. Boys learned to run 30 miles without water in desert heat that could kill an unprepared person in hours. They could move through mesquite so thick it would shred clothing, silent as shadows, invisible as mirages. But this wasn't just about individual skill. This was about creating a military culture where every warrior understood their role in a larger system. The Apache universe wasn't built around warfare alone, though. It revolved around mountain spirits who danced in sacred ceremonies that connected the living to powers older than memory. Grandmothers held the real power through matrilineal bloodlines. Imagine a society where your mother's family determined your status, where women's voices carried weight in decisions about war and peace. And during those long winter nights in hidden camps, intricate knowledge of desert survival passed from elder to child through storytelling that was part entertainment, part university, part military academy. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1540, fresh from conquering the Aztec and Inca empires, they expected easy conquest. After all, they'd toppled civilizations with millions of people. How hard could a few scattered desert tribes be? What they found instead were warriors who could disappear into landscapes that seemed completely barren to European eyes, but held 100 hiding places known to Apache scouts. Picture the Spanish perspective here. You're a conquistador used to fighting enemies who build cities, who mass armies in open fields, who follow European rules of warfare. Suddenly you're facing fighters who know every water source for hundreds of miles, who can live off plants you've never seen, who strike without warning and vanish like they were never there. It's like trying to fight ghosts who can kill you. Through 2 centuries of Spanish rule, Apache raiders extracted tribute from settlements while maintaining the most delicate of balances. They'd strike terror when they needed to demonstrate power, trade peacefully when it was advantageous, always keeping the colonizers uncertain and afraid. This wasn't random violence, this was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to keep enemies off balance while protecting Apache sovereignty. But here's what the Spanish never understood. They weren't fighting individual bands or tribes. They were fighting a culture that had spent centuries perfecting the art of desert warfare. Every raid taught lessons that spread through the network of Apache bands. Every Spanish tactical adjustment was studied, countered, and turned into Apache advantage. The Spanish brought horses, and the Apache became some of the finest mounted warriors in history. The Spanish brought metal weapons, and the Apache learned to use them better than their makers. The Spanish brought new diseases, and the Apache developed treatments using desert plants that Spanish doctors had never imagined. At every turn, the Apache proved that adaptation without abandonment of core identity was not just possible, it was the key to survival. By the early 1800s, as Spanish colonial power began to crumble across the Americas, the Apache had created something unprecedented, a military culture that controlled vast territories without building cities, that maintained sovereignty without formal armies, that preserved ancient ways while adopting new technologies. They had turned the desert itself into their greatest weapon. But change was coming from the East, change that would test every lesson learned during those centuries of Spanish conflict. A new enemy was approaching, one with different ideas about warfare, different concepts of land ownership, and a hunger for territory that would dwarf anything the Apache had faced before. The Americans were coming, and they would bring the most devastating challenge Apache had ever encountered. The 1800s brought American expansion crashing into Apache territories like flash floods through desert arroyos, sudden, devastating, and impossible to predict. But this wasn't just another clash between cultures. This was the collision between two completely different ways of understanding the world itself, and the sparks from that collision would light fires across the Southwest for the next 40 years. Meet Mangas Coloradas, whose name means red sleeves in Spanish. Standing 6 feet 4 inches in his moccasins, imagine that height in an era when the average man barely reached 5.5 feet. This Chiricahua leader possessed something that had never existed before in Apache history, the vision to unite bands that had raided separately for generations. Picture him moving through mountain strongholds, speaking to warriors who had spent centuries perfecting the art of independent warfare, convincing them that survival now demanded unity. His son-in-law Cochise commanded loyalty so absolute that warriors would charge into cannon fire at his word. Think about what that means. These weren't soldiers following orders because they had to. These were free men choosing to follow a leader they believed in completely. When Cochise spoke of war, men who could disappear into desert landscapes chose instead to stand and fight impossible odds because they trusted his judgment with their lives. Initially, these leaders sought peace with the Americans. This wasn't weakness. This was strategic thinking. Mangas Coloradas actually guided American miners to copper deposits in his territory, hoping to establish the kind of beneficial relationship that had sometimes worked with Spanish colonists. He understood that Americans brought new technologies, new opportunities, and potentially new allies against traditional enemies like the Mexicans and Comanches. But betrayal followed betrayal like links in a chain forged in hell. Imagine being invited to peace talks and served poisoned food. Picture negotiators arriving under flags of truce, only to be murdered the moment they dismounted their horses. And then came the horror that broke whatever trust remained, the Camp Grant massacre of 1871, where 144 peaceful Apaches died in their sleep, butchered by a mob of Tucson citizens who crept into their camp before dawn like cowards. Among the dead were women who had been weaving baskets just hours before, children who had been playing games that mimicked the warrior training they'd begin in a few years, elders who carried memories stretching back to the first Spanish contact. These weren't combatants, these were Apache families who had chosen to trust American promises of protection, and they paid for that trust with their lives. The Apache Wars erupted like volcanic fury contained too long beneath the Earth's surface. What followed were decades of the most brilliant guerrilla campaigns in military history, where 70 warriors could pin down 5,000 soldiers, where the U.S. Army, fresh from defeating the Confederacy in the largest war America had ever fought, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by forces they outnumbered 50 to 1. Consider the strategic genius of Apache warfare. They launched simultaneous raids across thousand-mile fronts, stretching military resources so thin that protecting one settlement meant abandoning 3 others. They created false trails that led cavalry units in circles through desert heat until horses collapsed and men hallucinated from dehydration. Their intelligence networks used mirror signals that could transmit messages across mountain ranges faster than any telegraph line, allowing Apache leaders to coordinate movements with precision that amazed their enemies. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. Alongside these legendary warriors rode Apache women who fought with equal ferocity. Lozan, Geronimo's spiritual advisor, used powers that warriors believed allowed her to sense enemy movements miles away. She could hold her arms outstretched, palms forward, and feel tingling that told her which direction danger approached. Whether you believe in such abilities or not, the warriors around her certainly did, and their faith in her guidance made them more effective fighters. Apache children learned to remain silent during forced marches that would break adult civilians, understanding that one cry might mean death for everyone. Picture kids as young as 5 years old, walking through desert terrain that challenged seasoned soldiers, never complaining, never asking for rest, because they knew their people's survival depended on absolute discipline. Apache elders preserved ceremonies even as their world burned around them, conducting rituals in hidden canyons while army patrols searched the mesas above. They understood something that military leaders missed. This wasn't just a war for territory. This was a war for identity, for the right to exist as Apache people in an Apache way. Geronimo himself became something more than a war leader. He became a symbol of resistance so powerful that his very name caused frontier families to abandon homesteads and flee to distant cities. Newspaper headlines across America trumpeted his movements like tracking a natural disaster. "Geronimo raids again," sold papers from New York to San Francisco, as Americans followed the exploits of this Apache leader who seemed capable of being everywhere and nowhere at once. But the numbers were inexorable. For every Apache warrior, there were hundreds of American soldiers. For every Apache family, there were thousands of settlers demanding protection. The railroad brought endless supplies to military outposts, while Apache bands struggled to find ammunition for weapons captured in raids. Telegraph lines carried orders faster than Apache runners, and army posts sprouted like desert flowers after rare rains, creating a network of bases that gradually squeezed Apache freedom into smaller and smaller spaces. The Apache fought with everything they had: courage, cunning, spiritual power, and knowledge of terrain that gave them advantages no academy training could match. They won battle after battle, raid after raid, but wars aren't won by tactical victories alone. They're won by whoever can sustain the fight longest, and America's resources seemed as endless as Apache determination. As the 1880s dawned, even the most optimistic Apache leaders began to understand that their choices were narrowing to surrender or extinction. The question wasn't whether the war would end, it was how many of their people would survive to see whatever came next. And what came next would test Apache resilience in ways that warfare never could. September 8, 1886. Remember that date, because it marks one of the most devastating betrayals in American history and the beginning of a story that would define what it means to survive the impossible. Geronimo's final band, 16 men, 14 women, and 6 children, stood in the desert heat facing General Nelson Miles, who promised reunion with their families already imprisoned in Florida. These weren't just any promises. Miles gave his word as an officer and a gentleman that surrender meant joining loved ones, not permanent exile. He swore on his honor that after a brief cooling-off period, all Apaches would return to their homeland. Geronimo, exhausted by decades of warfare that had claimed most of his followers, chose to believe. What happened instead was one of the most systematic acts of ethnic cleansing in American history. Cattle cars, the same kind used to transport livestock, carried 498 Apaches eastward toward humidity and disease they had never experienced. Picture this: people who had spent their entire lives in desert air, so dry it cracked lips, suddenly forced into swampland where breathing felt like drowning, where their lungs, adapted to high altitude and arid conditions, struggled with every breath. Augustine, Florida, became their prison, the same stone fortress where Spanish colonists had held prisoners 3 centuries earlier. These walls had witnessed centuries of suffering, but nothing quite like this. Warriors who had once commanded territories larger than many European countries now swept floors for soldier guards, who often couldn't read or write. Men who had navigated by stars and tracked enemies across hundreds of miles now shuffled through corridors, forbidden to see the sky except during supervised exercise periods. The killing began immediately, but it wasn't bullets that claimed Apache lives, it was the environment itself. Tuberculosis and malaria swept through the prison like wildfire through dry grass. 119 Apaches died in the first 2 years alone. Think about those numbers. These weren't battle casualties, these were preventable deaths from diseases that thrived in the humid conditions that made Florida uninhabitable for desert people. Children died first, their small bodies unable to adapt to air thick with moisture and pathogens their immune systems had never encountered. Elders followed, their lungs filling with fluid as they struggled for breath in air that felt like soup. Warriors who had survived countless battles, who had outrun cavalry across scorching deserts, who had endured wounds and hardships that would have killed lesser men, they wasted away in stone cells while army doctors recorded their deaths with clinical detachment. But within this nightmare emerged the moment that gives our entire story its name. Picture this scene: hungry Apache prisoners, fed meager rations of spoiled beef and moldy bread that wouldn't have been served to dogs, watched American guards roasting corn over evening fires. The smell drifted through prison windows, sweet, earthy, nothing like the hard field corn Apaches knew from occasional raids on Mexican settlements. When guards offered some to prisoners as a rare gesture of something resembling kindness, warriors who had survived on desert plants during month-long pursuits initially scoffed. Corn was horse food, animal fodder, beneath human dignity. These were men who had eaten cactus fruit and pine nuts, who had made soup from grass seeds and survived on protein from insects when necessary. Accepting corn from their captors felt like accepting defeat itself. But empty bellies override pride, and when they finally tasted those sweet kernels so different from anything they had experienced, something shifted in ways that went far beyond simple hunger satisfaction. The corn was actually good. More than good, it was comforting in a way that transcended mere nutrition. Here, in the worst circumstances imaginable, they had discovered something unexpectedly pleasant, something that connected to memories of better times when Apache families had gathered around fires telling stories and sharing whatever food the land provided. Prisoners began requesting corn, something that astonished their guards who had expected continued defiance. They started roasting it themselves during those brief periods when they were allowed access to fires. They shared it in small ceremonies that echoed the homeland gatherings they thought they would never experience again. Women taught children Apache words for different stages of corn preparation, ensuring that language and tradition survived even in prison cells. Finding comfort in this simple food became a bridge between defiance and survival that would sustain them through 27 years of captivity. It wasn't surrender, it was adaptation without abandonment of identity, the same principle that had allowed Apache culture to survive centuries of warfare. They discovered that accepting small kindnesses didn't mean accepting defeat, That finding moments of pleasure didn't mean forgetting their suffering, that adaptation could be a form of resistance rather than capitulation. The corn became a symbol of something larger, the possibility that survival might take forms they had never imagined. Sharing it created bonds between prisoners who might otherwise have descended into despair or turned against each other. Teaching children about it ensured that some Apache knowledge would survive even if everything else was lost. Army officers noted in their reports that Apache prisoners had developed an unusual fondness for corn, never understanding that they were witnessing one of the most profound examples of cultural resilience in human history. What looked like simple dietary preference was actually a masterclass in psychological survival, a demonstration that the human spirit could find sustenance even in the depths of designed cruelty. As years passed, that corn became more than food, it became hope itself. When Apache prisoners were transferred between facilities, they carried knowledge of corn preparation like they carried memories of home. When children were born in captivity, they learned about corn as they learned about mountain spirits and traditional ways. When elders died, they passed on corn ceremonies, along with other sacred knowledge. 27 years. Think about that span of time. Children grew to adulthood having never seen the desert landscapes their parents described in whispered conversations. Warriors aged into elders without ever again riding free across territories they had once defended. Women bore and raised children in captivity, teaching them Apache ways in stolen moments between supervised activities. Yet, through it all, the corn remained simple, sweet, and somehow sacred, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human capacity for finding light, for creating meaning, for maintaining hope, could never be completely extinguished. But eventually, even the longest nights must end, and freedom was coming, though the world they would return to would be nothing like the one they had left behind. Liberation came slowly, like dawn breaking over desert mountains after the longest night in Apache history. As prisoners moved between Fort Marion, Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and finally Fort Sill in Oklahoma, they maintained their identity through ceremonies conducted in whispered voices and languages, spoken only when guards weren't listening. What Army officials never understood was that physical captivity couldn't imprison Apache culture. It could only force it underground, where it grew stronger in darkness like desert roots reaching toward hidden water. When freedom finally arrived in 1913, a full 27 years after that September surrender, the 261 surviving Apaches returned to find a world transformed beyond recognition. Their lands had been carved up and sold to settlers who built farms and towns on territories that had once echoed with Apache horses and ceremonies. Sacred sites had been desecrated, turned into tourist attractions or mining claims by people who saw only economic opportunity, where Apaches saw spiritual connection stretching back to creation itself. The children presented perhaps the most heartbreaking challenge. Entire generations had been raised in government boarding schools designed specifically to kill the Indian and save the man, as reformers put it with chilling directness. These young people returned as strangers to their own families, speaking English better than Apache, more comfortable with industrial schedules than seasonal ceremonies, often unable to recognize the plants and animals that had sustained their ancestors for centuries. But here's where the Apache story becomes truly remarkable. Apache resilience proved stronger than any government policy designed to destroy it. The same adaptability that had allowed them to survive warfare, captivity, and cultural assault now became the foundation for rebirth. Leaders like James K. Wakeler, who had survived imprisonment as a child, became advocates bridging traditional knowledge with modern political systems, understanding that survival in the 20th century required mastering the legal and bureaucratic tools that Americans used to control indigenous peoples. Apache women, drawing on those ancient matrilineal traditions, quietly reconstituted clan structures that bureaucrats thought had been permanently broken. They taught children traditional stories while helping them navigate American schools. They preserved healing ceremonies while learning to work with modern medical professionals. They maintained spiritual connections to homeland landscapes while building new communities on reservations that bore little resemblance to their ancestral territories. The early decades brought challenges that would have crushed people with less determination. Poverty was crushing. Imagine trying to build an economy from nothing, on land that wasn't your choice, with skills that didn't match the industrial world growing around you. Discrimination was systematic and legal, with Apache people denied basic rights that other Americans took for granted. Disease continued to ravage communities, still adjusting to climates and conditions their bodies weren't designed for. Yet the Apache people not only survived, they began to thrive in ways that honored both their traditions and their new circumstances. The corn that had sustained them through captivity became a bridge to agricultural innovation as Apache farmers learned to grow crops that could succeed in their new environments while maintaining the spiritual connections to farming that had sustained their ancestors. The 20th century brought remarkable transformations that few could have predicted during those dark years of imprisonment. When World War II erupted, Apache men volunteered to serve in the same army that had once hunted their grandfathers, but they did so on their own terms. Apache code talkers used their languages, those same tongues that army schools had tried to beat out of Apache children, to create communication systems so effective that they saved countless American lives across Pacific battlefields. Picture the irony. The languages that government officials had declared primitive and worthless became tools of modern warfare, so sophisticated that enemy code breakers never managed to crack them. Apache words that had once coordinated raids against American settlements now coordinated American attacks against Japanese positions. The military recognition that Apache veterans received was recognition their warrior ancestors had never gotten, acknowledgement that Apache tactical genius had always been worthy of respect rather than extinction. The 1970s brought sovereignty movements that transformed Apache communities from dependent wards of the federal government into self-governing nations with their own laws, their own courts, and their own determination of citizenship. This wasn't just political change, this was the culmination of a century-long struggle to maintain Apache identity while adapting to American legal systems. Treaties that had been ignored for generations suddenly became foundations for modern governmental structures that balanced traditional leadership with contemporary needs. Casino revenues beginning in the 1990s provided economic power that Apache leaders could never have imagined during the desperate years of the late 1800s. Suddenly, Apache nations had resources to fund education, healthcare, cultural preservation, and economic development on their own terms. Money that came from non-native gamblers funded Apache language programs, traditional craft revival, and scholarship programs that sent Apache students to universities while maintaining their connections to home communities. Today, 56,000 enrolled Apache people live across multiple reservations and urban communities, connected by shared history, maintained traditions, and modern communication technology that would have seemed like magic to their imprisoned ancestors. Apache languages are taught in schools alongside English and Spanish. Traditional ceremonies continue in settings that blend ancient practices with contemporary needs. Apache artists, educators, politicians, and business leaders contribute to American society while maintaining distinctly Apache identities. And corn remains central to Apache life in ways that honor both survival and tradition. It's served at ceremonies that welcome children into Apache identity and honor elders who maintained that identity through the darkest times. It appears in tribal restaurants that feature both traditional preparations and fusion cuisines that reflect Apache people's journey through multiple cultures. It's remembered in stories of prisoners who found unexpected comfort in enemy food, teaching new generations that adaptation without abandoning core identity remains the greatest Apache victory of all. The corn that sustained Apache prisoners through 27 years of captivity now grows in Apache gardens, where children learn the same lessons their ancestors carried from Canada centuries ago, that survival requires both roots deep enough to find hidden water and flexibility enough to bend without breaking when storms come. In every kernel, in every shared meal, in every story told around modern fires, the Apache victory continues. Not the victory of war, but the victory of a people who refused to disappear, who transformed suffering into strength, and who proved that no amount of cruelty can destroy a culture determined to survive. That's the real story behind why we still tell this tale. Not because of the warfare, not because of the famous names, but because of the quiet triumph of ordinary people who found extraordinary ways to remain Apache through circumstances designed to make that impossible. In a world that often feels like it's losing its connections to tradition, to place, to identity itself, the Apache story offers something precious, proof that holding on to who you are doesn't mean refusing to change, and that the sweetest victories sometimes come disguised as the simplest gifts.